John, you're very welcome to be here tonight. Thank you for coming. And I've known John a good while, but I thought I'd better find out a little bit more about him. So I have. And he's a Reverend Prebendary Dr. John Daniels. And he's been teaching biblical studies and mission at the Ludlow Hub of Cuddesdon College in Gloucester and Hereford. He's also taught on diocesan and regional ministry education courses in Cumbria, Yorkshire and Wales. And his background, which is fascinating, is in earth sciences, having gained a PhD in physical oceanography in the 1980s. And as what I know him as is an invaluable member of the Green Christian Join Enough team. So a very warm welcome tonight, John. Your talk is supported by the Montgomery Trust, I understand. And the title is Running Out of Steam. Should Christians Welcome the End of Fossil Fuels? Right, over to you, John. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you for your generous words and for your welcome. Very good to be with you all this evening. So what I'm going to do straight away, and otherwise I will forget to do so, is I am going to share my screen with you because there will be quite a lot of slides which I want us to whiz through at a bit of a rate of knots this evening. I should apologize in advance for any information overload that may occur in the course of what we're going to look at. I can only, in my defense, let you know that I've halved the number of slides I originally put together for this presentation, which a version of which I offered in person up in Yorkshire back in the autumn. So, but what I suggest that you do is, as questions occur to you, you just jot them down, pop them in the chat if you like. That might be quite a useful thing to do, but in any event, there'll be an opportunity to shoot some questions past us afterwards. And as best I can, I will seek to fill in any gaps that I may have left, or if there's any kind of spin-off questions that you have, I'll do my best to respond to those. I hope you can all see my screen now. I've slightly cunningly tweaked the title. I hope that doesn't leave you feel cheated straight away, as Life After Fossil Fuels, Living Well with Less. And that word less, I think, is really important for us to note. And I hope it'll become apparent in the course of the presentation why I've stressed that less element as being a crucial component of what our future has in store for us, I think, regardless of whatever route we take from here. The Green New Deal is something we've heard a great deal about in recent times. The current Biden administration in the US had that as a key element of its platform. The Inflation Reduction Act embodies that, a kind of a reindustrialization program for the US, very much focused on high-tech, renewable energies and infrastructure associated with that. And also in Europe, not so much in the UK, although things may change this year if there's a general election, as there will be later on. But in Europe also, the notion of a European Green Deal has been very prominent, particularly coming out of the pandemic and trying to kickstart the economy, really as a means for trying to kickstart the economy. So there's a lot of talk about that around in the atmosphere at the moment. My concern about it, though, is that it's not necessarily awfully realistic. Because what it seems to assume is that currently we have a society which is a busy, industrial, post-industrial society, which is powered by dirty, polluting fossil fuels. And what we need to do, it seems to suggest, is simply unplug from that dirty, polluting fuel source and instead plug into nice, clean, renewable energy. And we can carry on living pretty much as we do now. I mean, people don't usually say that explicitly, but that seems to be the subtext. Well, it's not clear to me that that's necessarily going to be the case. And I want to unpack this evening some of the reasons why I think that's so, and why we need, therefore, not least as Christians, to be preparing ourselves for a future which is going to be potentially really very different from the past. And when I say future, I'm not talking about 20, 30 years down the road. I'm talking about these next years in the course of the 2020s. This stuff could be coming upon us far quicker than we think. So first of all, we need to get a handle on how much energy we currently use. So here's a little exercise for you. Each day, people in the UK use energy for many different forms for many different purposes, as we know. Now, if we depended only on the work of human beings to provide this energy, rather than that of machines and animals, how many slaves would the average person in the UK need to have working for them? So I've offered you some options there: 6, 12, 26, 52. How many energy slaves would each one of us in the UK, all 67, 68 million people of us, how many would we need? Well, the answer is 52. An averagely fit person working steadily produces about 50 watts. Do you remember the old-fashioned incandescent light bulbs? Enough to power one of those. Now, in terms of the total final energy demand of the British economy divided by the number of people living in the country, we would, each one of us, man, woman, and child, need 52 slaves working for us around the clock, 52 round the clock, 52 weeks, 365 days of the year in order to achieve that. And if we were to pay them the minimum wage, then that would cost each one of us something like £4.75 million a year. So that is simply illustrating the extraordinary benefit we have extracted from cheap, abundant fossil fuel energy in large measure increasingly over the course of the last 200 years. And we've taken it for granted. We've taken it for granted. Now, for various reasons, that era is likely coming to an end. And it's important to put this into context because Homo sapiens as a species, we've been around for maybe 200,000 or 300,000 years. And for most of that time, we've been living lives along the lines depicted in the top right-hand picture there. Foraging societies, essentially extended families living off the land. And in terms of energy consumption, people estimate it would be they used to consume something like 10 to 20 gigajoules per person per year. Now, what's a gigajoule doesn't really matter. It's the comparative numbers that are important. And that includes the food that people ate. When people discovered farming off the back of the Neolithic Revolution about 10,000 years ago, the amount of energy consumption increased to something between 40 and 70 gigajoules. And these days in the European Union, the average is about 250 gigajoules. In North America, you won't be surprised, I'm sure, to learn that that number is quite a bit higher. So, but look at the way in which the per person energy consumption has increased as we move through these three different forms of human civilization. Now, I find this to be a telling quote from this gentleman, George Orwell. Orwell said, "Our civilization is founded on coal," writing in 1937, remember. "Our civilization is founded on coal more completely than one realizes until one stops to think of it. The machines that keep us alive, the machines that make machines, are all directly or indirectly dependent upon coal. In the metabolism of the Western world, the coal miner is second in importance only to the man who plows the soil." Now, had he been writing even 20 years later, he wouldn't have said coal, he would have said oil. And the graph on the left is, I think, fascinating. It illustrates the way in which dependence on coal increased from virtually zero in the early part of the 18th century to becoming enormous, certainly by the time you reach the 20th century. So what we've got there, just explain what that diagram on the left is doing. On the x-axis, got time, 1750 through to about 1915. And on the y-axis, the upright axis there, you've got a measure of area. And the green area that's shaded in on the left there reflects the total land surface of the United Kingdom. It's about 250,000 square kilometers. Now, what the authors of this paper did was to work out the amount of energy that was being produced in the UK year by year across this period from the burning of coal. And then they converted that into the amount of energy that would be produced by simply burning wood. Okay, so it's coal use as virtual forest area is how they expressed it. And what they discovered was that by around about 1850, if you look at that at the chart there, the UK each year was consuming as much energy via the burning of coal as you would have got if you covered the whole of the surface of the UK with trees during that year, chopped them all down and burnt them to produce energy. And of course, after 1850, our coal use as virtual forest area exceeded the total territorial area of the UK. So in other words, we could not possibly have seen the Industrial Revolution take off in the way that it did if we'd been purely reliant on timber. And even if miraculously we were able to regenerate a whole UK's worth of timber every year. And it's all to do with the energy density of coal and of fossil fuels more generally compared to that of wood. And globally, the picture is very similar. So this is global primary energy supply over 200 from 1820 to 2022. And as you can see there, the total energy supply has increased by a factor of 25 globally over that 200 odd year period. The other thing I want you to notice here is that at the very bottom there, in the sort of lime green, you can see traditional biomass. So that's timber and other sort of things like grasses and so forth, crops that are basically cultivated in order to burn to produce energy. Although over the course of those 200 years, we've seen coal, oil and gas and so forth appear on the scene, they have not supplanted traditional biomass. In fact, there's as much traditional biomass still being consumed now as was back in 1820, maybe slightly more. And indeed, as every single new energy source has come online, as oil has come online, as gas has come online, as wind and solar have come online, what they haven't done is supplant or replace existing energy sources. They've simply added on to those existing energy sources. So if we're talking about an energy transition to renewable energies, simply producing more and more solar and wind doesn't automatically mean we're going to be using less coal, oil and gas while that coal, oil and gas remains available. Okay, so that's a key thing to notice. There's no automatic transition there. If there's more energy available, people somewhere will use that as an additional source of energy to what they're currently accessing, rather than replacing what they're currently using. That I think is an important lesson to note, while those existing sources remain available. And a barrel of crude oil, horrible stuff, but actually incredibly concentrated in terms of the amount of energy that it contains. So a barrel of crude oil, if you were to burn it at about 35% efficiency, which is kind of typical to produce electricity, it would generate about 2 gigajoules. Well, how much is that? Well, it's enough to keep the average UK household going for about a fortnight. All right, that's at current consumption rates. Now, if you were living on the west coast of Scotland, where there's a decent lick of wind much of the time, and you had a 6 kilowatt rural domestic turbine outside your door, what you would find is that over an average fortnight, you would probably produce, getting on for as much energy as that barrel of oil would produce converted into electricity. So that doesn't look too bad. But if instead, at an average UK location, you had 10 square meters of solar panels on your roof, it would take you 3 months to generate the energy which the average UK household is currently consuming in just a fortnight. For obvious reasons, it's dark half the time. You know, we don't see that much sunshine in the UK. So again, in terms of the concentration of energy that we have in fossil fuels, we really have to take seriously what an extraordinary boon they've represented during the last 200 years that we've been exploiting them. And oil doesn't just produce petrol and diesel. On the left there, there's a graphic which illustrates the fractional distillation of crude oil. As you can see, it produces a whole range of different things. Most of it, by volume, actually goes into producing petrol or gasoline, something, depending on where in the world the oils come from, something of the order of 40% of it. Another 25% or so will go into producing diesel. And this is all to do really with the combination of the different hydrocarbon molecules that make up a particular unit of crude oil. But alongside it, obviously, some of the thicker components that come off it, the longer molecule chains, also produce lubricating oils, waxes and polishes. They produce, getting down towards the bottom there of the illustration, fuel, bunker fuel for ships, and also bitumen for roads. So if we were to just stop oil tomorrow, not only will we not have any fuel for our cars and our lorries, which basically means, where are we going to transport food, for example, from between A and B, but also there's an issue of, for example, what do we do about roads? I mean, do we still want roads? Round here at the moment, I sometimes think we've got more pothole than road. Well, I'm sure it's maybe the same with you. So, I mean, there are solutions to these things, but it's not straightforward how we transition away from an economy and a way of life which has become fashioned around fossil fuels, and particularly around oil over the course of the last century. There's many challenges to overcome there. And another aspect of this, moving on from oil to natural gas, is the green revolution. Synthetic fertilizers created by the Haber-Bosch process, which effectively involves taking nitrogen from the atmosphere and combining it with hydrogen that's derived from natural gas, a process that was pioneered, again, not that long ago, just over a century ago. And as energy analyst Vaclav Smil puts it, without the Haber-Bosch process, which is dependent at the moment on natural gas, almost 2/5 of the world's population would not be here. And that's all because of the increase in yields that these synthetic fertilizers and indeed the herbicides that are associated with them have produced. And on the right there, I've just put up a graphic which is UK wheat yields between 1885 and 2011. And as you can see there, all the way through until about the late 1940s, yields are pretty static at between 2 and 3 tons per hectare. And then suddenly you get this the green revolution kicking in essentially, and it decreases up to something like 8 tons per hectare by the time you get to about 1990 or so, or perhaps 1980s, something like that. But then it's flattened off again. Actually, there's a huge issue to do with the sustainability of this industrial farming model in any event, which is something, again, I've found myself being introduced to as I've researched the topic. We don't have time to get into that this evening. But again, just to flag up at this point, again, how dependent we are as a world on fossil fuels, not only in terms of being a source of energy, but also in terms of a source of food for us indirectly as well. And so, as you can see, this is just charting global population and primary energy supply over the last 200 years. The purple line is population in billions. The yellow line is global primary energy consumption. And as you can see, the scales on the two sides are different, but essentially the curve looks very similar. And notice in both cases, there's that inflection point in and around 1950, where the lines begin to get a bit steeper. Again, that's the green revolution kicking in. That's the oil-based society in which we now live becoming normative across the world. There's a strong correlation there. And the same applies if you map global primary energy supply against gross world product. Now, gross world product is essentially a measure of how rich we are, the amount of income in money terms that is being generated all over the world in the global economy at any given time. Now, as a measure of true human prosperity, gross world product, gross domestic product has got a lot of problems. It's a highly imperfect measure, but it's kind of the best easy metric that we have to hand. And each one of these green crosses here it reflects the values of global primary energy supply against gross world product for a particular year between 1820 and 2022. And as you can see, it's a pretty strong correlation, isn't it, really? Pretty much a straight line with a few kinks here and there. And the take home from this is that the more energy we've consumed, the richer we've got in aggregate. I mean, obviously, some people have got massively richer than others, and we in the global north thus far have benefited much more than those in other parts of the world. But again, do notice this correlation between energy consumption and affluence. We need to be very aware about that. And the conclusion, really, the take home from all of this preamble is that cheap, abundant fossil fuel energy has transformed standards of living. And just think of the kind of pattern of life that your grandparents lived, my grandparents lived. My grandmother passed away in the early 1980s. I mean, there's much about the pattern of life that we have now, which even then she would have found, extraordinarily luxurious and ostentatious. She was brought up in much simpler times. So again, we need to notice how much of a difference that fossil fuels have made to ways of life, certainly in this part of the world. But we are looking at a situation, aren't we, where abundance may be coming to an end. And there are two reasons for that. One is because of the adverse consequences associated with the combustion of fossil fuels. And with this audience, I'm not going to labor the point about anthropogenic climate change. You know all about that. There's Greta and Just Stop Oil. We mentioned that already. But another reason that abundance is almost certainly coming to an end, which is much less spoken about, which I find intriguing, is the fact that actually on the supply side also we are beginning to hit the buffers. And this is a report from Carbon Brief from 2020, which summarizes a report that came out from BP back then, which indicated that global oil production had probably peaked in November of 2018. Now the data is in now for the last 5 years as well, and that impression has been confirmed. Despite the fact that we've recovered from all the pandemic stuff, nonetheless, global oil productions hasn't reached the levels it was at the end of 2018, and that's not because there's not enough demand for it. It's down to some more fundamental problems which are to do with the fact that we've essentially plucked all the low-hanging fruit. And we would be in even worse trouble were it not for the fact that, for better or for worse, US shale oil has come to the rescue of our way of life over the course of the last 15 years and has produced, as it were, a kind of bonus amount of fossil fuel energy for us on the back of that. This is the results of a study by a guy called Steve Moore, who works in Australia, and his colleagues. And they had to go back in 2021 at predicting when peak annual fossil fuel production will occur. And that's not just oil, but coal and natural gas in there as well. And the red line is their best guess. And as you can see, they reckon that production of these three together was going to peak probably last year, right? Now, if you're optimistic or pessimistic, depending on which way you look at it, it might continue to climb till about 2050. That's the green line. But in any event, we're looking at steadily depleting natural resources, which are getting harder to get at, which are becoming more and more expensive to access, which are requiring more and more energy to be able to get out of the ground. And that is bound to impact on the quality of life of people like you and me who depend routinely, without thinking about it, on these fossil fuels to power our lives. So I want to spend a few minutes now just looking at some of the outputs from what is a super piece of work. This is the Zero Carbon Britain project, which has come out of the Centre for Alternative Technology near Machynlleth in Mid Wales. They've been running this project now for, oh gosh, it must be at least 15 years. And they've brought out, I think, 3 different iterations of their Zero Carbon Britain scenario. The aim of this is to come up with a coherent plan for how we transition from our existing situation to a Britain which has no fossil fuels featured in its energy mix, but also no nuclear as well. And this is a graphic from the report. On the left-hand side there, you've got energy supply. On the right-hand side, you've got energy demand. And in each case, you've got the situation, the actual situation in 2017, which was the baseline they used for the latest version of this report, compared with the ZCB scenario. That's the Zero Carbon Britain scenario. Now, there is a huge amount of information just on this slide. We could spend the whole evening just analyzing it, but I just want to, for the purposes of getting us to bed eventually tonight, focus on just two features of this. First of all, look at where the energy is coming from, where the bulk of the energy is coming from in zero carbon Britain. And it's coming from wind power. Okay, so just notice that on the energy supply side. And on the energy demand side, on the right-hand side, notice that in zero carbon Britain, energy consumption, energy demand will be down to just 40% of what it is at the moment, or at least what it was in 2017, and it hasn't really changed too much since then. Now that, if you're thinking that's a huge reduction, John, 60% down to what we've currently got, well, you're right. And there are consequences that follow from that, and we'll touch on one or two of them over the next few minutes. So first of all, let's look at wind power in a bit more detail. So what we've got here is a table which shows three things. First of all, the current deployment of wind power in the UK, both onshore and offshore. So currently we've got roughly about 15 gigawatts of installed capacity, both onshore and offshore. Now, in the proposal that came out of our current government back in April of 2022, the proposal was to basically not do anything in terms of expanding onshore capacity, but looking to increase offshore capacity from 14.7 to 50 gigawatts. And that's quite a substantial increase. And when that report came out, somebody worked out that if you were aiming to get this in place by 2030, which was the intention, that would mean installing a offshore turbine, a single wind offshore turbine every day between April 2022 and 2030. You know, it's a pretty ambitious target. Now, Zero Carbon Britain, by contrast, wants to push the envelope a lot further. So they envisage doubling the onshore production capacity, generation capacity, to 30 gigawatts, and increasing the offshore capacity almost by an order of magnitude to from 14.7, 15 to 140 gigawatts. So that's a huge deployment of additional wind turbines, particularly offshore. But you may be thinking to yourself, that sounds great, but what happens when the wind doesn't blow? Because occasionally we do get these periods, don't we? When I remember when we first moved to Ludlow about 14 years ago, we had a winter where we had felt like 2 months where we had a massive, great big high pressure system sitting over the country, no wind and bitterly cold. And how do we deal with those situations? Well, they've done some maths, have the people at the Centre for Alternative Technology, and they reckon that based on historical experience, electricity demand would exceed supply in their scenario 26% of the time, more than a quarter of the time. Now, some of those periods will be very, very short. They might just be milliseconds. They could extend all the way through from milliseconds through hours, days to weeks and months, potentially. And as you can see there, they've some provision for this. So 15% of the time, the shorter time intervals when demand exceeds supply, they envisage it making up for the shortfall through pumped water storage. That's where you basically, when you've got lots of electricity, you use it to pump water uphill and keep it in a reservoir, such that when demand exceeds supply, you just release that water and that turns the turbine and generates more electricity. Battery storage is another sort of short-term strategy that they include, and that includes drawing energy from electric vehicles which are plugged into the mains, not currently running, domestic hot water storage, and also again shifting demand to other times, getting people to shift their electricity usage to times when the energy is available rather than when they actually might happen to want it to take place. And if you watched Einstein and those TV adverts trying to sell you a smart meter, that is all part of that scenario. It's trying to regulate consumption in such a way that it can be made compatible with the sorts of constraints that this kind of a zero carbon scenario will make inevitable. But so that's 15% of the time. But for those longer time periods, weeks and months, they reckon about 11% of the time when demand exceeds supply. Zero Carbon Britain envisages burning biogas and synthetic gas in power stations to generate electricity, much in the way that natural gas is burned today. So just to give you a quick picture, again, a graphic from the report that illustrates a little bit of how this works. Up on the top right-hand corner there, you see the biomass. That's basically crops that have been grown specifically for this purpose. 230 odd units of that. 74 units of it goes through into a process where it's combined with hydrogen, which is produced by electrolysis from water, the electrolysis of water, which uses electricity, renewable electricity, of course. And out of that comes a mixture of biogas, which is methane, which is produced by anaerobic digestion, and synthetic gas, which is like a mixture of hydrogen that's come off the electrolysis plus carbon dioxide that's come out of the biomass. Most of that actually gets fed through to industry to keep industry going, but some of it goes through to power stations. It's burned at about 50% efficiency, they hope, to generate backup electricity. So that's kind of, you can see how the dynamic works. That's how they plan on keeping the lights on and on keeping us tolerably warm when the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining. But this has enormous implications for the British landscape, because where are these energy crops going to come from? Where are they going to be grown? So again, this is a graphic from the report. In the top left-hand corner, you can see land use in the UK today. The total surface area of the UK is about 240,000 square kilometers, about 24 mega hectares. And they've represented that, as you can see, by a rectangle. Now, notice all the pink stuff. This is the way land is currently being used in the UK today. Notice all the pink in that top left-hand corner. Now, that is grassland that is intended for livestock. Now, compare it to the amount of pink in the graphic on the bottom right-hand corner. That's the zero carbon Britain scenario. Huge decrease, about half, almost half of the land in the UK currently goes towards grassland for livestock. In zero carbon Britain, that's reduced to, what is it, about, well, less than 3 mega hectares. And instead, there's a big chunk there, you can see about 4 mega hectares, it goes towards fuel and energy crops. Now, immediately, just imagine how different the British landscape would look if it was transitioned in that way overnight. A massive change in the landscape, not impossible to achieve, but a huge upheaval. And of course, you've got to sell this to farmers and to landowners. This suddenly becomes, the implications of this transition suddenly become really pretty comprehensive. And incidentally, this area that's dedicated to fuel and energy crops, have you noticed everything in the end is a multiple of the size of Wales? I can't be the only one who's noticed that. Well, this area here, about 4 mega hectares, is equivalent to an area twice the size of Wales. So that's a big area that's being put aside for these energy crops, which are essential for keeping the lights on, for keeping us warm in the zero carbon scenario. And of course, this has implications for our diet as well, because if all this grassland is currently kind of feeding cattle and sheep isn't going to be there in the same quantity in the future, that has implications for our diet. Well, for those of us who are not yet vegans, we'll be reassured to know that in this sort of sample diet that Zero Carbon Britain offers us, we're still allowed 1 portion of red meat per week, 2 further smaller portions of pig or chicken, fillet of fish, and so forth. But again, it's merely to illustrate the change of lifestyles that are implied by the consequences of moving to a fossil fuel-free future. It isn't simply about the energy that comes out of our plugs coming from a different source. There are huge implications about our lifestyles that are all-encompassing, really. So I want to ask a couple of, I could say a lot more about that report, but I'm just going to quickly whiz through and ask 2 what I think are searching questions of it. This is not to say that the report therefore can be dismissed or it hasn't got anything useful in it. To the contrary, I think it's a crucially valuable piece of work. But there are a number of questions that it raises. First of all, will zero carbon Britain produce enough steam in terms of the energy that it'll make available to us? Because we noticed, didn't we, early on, that the energy demand in this scenario is 60% less than the energy demand that we're currently enjoying. in our lifestyles. Now, that sounds like a huge reduction. How on earth can we live on 60% less energy than we currently do? And as you notice, they've divided uh, the way energy is currently used into 4 different categories. Buildings, specifically heating and hot water, cooking, that's the pink. Then the green is cooking, lighting, and appliances. Yellow is industry, and blue is transport. And so you can see in zero carbon Britain, actually rather more energy goes into industry than currently does. So there's a kind of a slight reindustrialization paradigm in there. But the amount of energy that goes into heating buildings and for transport radically comes down. In this context, I find it really helpful to compare what zero carbon Britain is suggesting with what came out of a paper that was published back in 2020 by a guy called Milward Hopkins and his co-authors, which was entitled Providing Decent Living with Minimum Energy. And what they've done in this very comprehensive paper is to sort of work out on the basis of basic human needs how much energy it would take to sustain a person living in a particular part of the world, because obviously in different parts of the world, the energy demands will vary somewhat according to climate and so forth. As it happens, the figures for the UK are pretty close to the global average. And what I've charted there on the left is the 2021 actual final energy consumption per capita per person against what zero carbon Britain would propose. This is the per person per annum energy consumption. And there on the right-hand side, the UK decent living energy calculation that Milward Hopkins and his co-authors came up with. And it's incredibly small, isn't it? Isn't it tiny compared to what we actually currently use at the moment? This assumes that we are using the most efficient technologies and that demand, and this is the critical thing, is reduced to sufficiency levels. And there's the rub, isn't it? Sufficiency levels. And they end the paper with this comment. What sort of political economy would create a world with both low throughput and high living standards and the levels of equality that achieving these requires? What sort of culture would accept and support the necessary policies and institutions? Where, from individual to institutional level, are potential leverage points for moving towards such changes? So we can see here that we're talking about not simply a change in where our energy comes from, we're talking about cultural and indeed political changes, which are really quite daunting to consider once you begin to think through the implications. Technologically, it can be done. That's not a problem. You know, we have the tech to do it. The stumbling blocks lie elsewhere. Okay, I want to move on to another area very quickly, about which, again, there's quite a lot to be said, and that is quite apart from the issue of whether we have enough steam to keep life going in Britain under zero carbon Britain, do we have enough stuff to do that? Let me explain to you what I mean. And we talked about Wales as a sort of a unit of area. Well, I want to use the new Wembley Stadium as a unit of stuff. Okay, so let's look at wind turbines. Specifically, first of all, a typical large 2 megawatt onshore turbine. These are the kinds of things you see in some of these new energy parks that are going up around the place now. Now, a single two megawatt onshore turbine requires 750 cubic meters of concrete, which means that the new Wembley Stadium has got as much concrete in it as about 120 of these turbines. And that means also, therefore, that zero carbon Britain would require about 63 Wembley Stadiums worth of concrete. And bear in mind that all concrete or cement manufacture specifically inevitably produces carbon dioxide simply because of the chemistry of the process, regardless of the fuel that's used. So if you're going to produce concrete at the moment, you will inevitably produce carbon dioxide unless you put a gadget on top of the factory where you're doing that to capture the carbon dioxide, which I'll come along to later. If you look offshore you get some really chunky turbines. 10 megawatt these days is not unusual. There's some 20 megawatt turbines coming on stream around the world now. But a 10 megawatt turbine requires 3,000 tons of steel, just one turbine, which means the Wembley Stadium contains the equivalent of 8 turbines worth of steel, and zero carbon Britain would require no fewer than 1,630 Wembley Stadiums worth of steel to produce the installed capacity that I mentioned earlier. And bear in mind that wind turbines don't last forever. Particularly if they're out there in the middle of the North Sea or somewhere, you've got 20 or 30 years of work that they can carry out for you before they have to be replaced. And many parts of those turbines, for example, the rotor blades that go around, at the moment cannot be recycled. So important to notice these things. And did you know, by the way, that concrete is responsible for 9% of total greenhouse gas emissions at the moment? And that 7 metals, iron, aluminium, copper, zinc, lead, nickel, and manganese, are responsible for an additional 7%. So again, industrial processes are hugely as we currently know them, are currently demanding of energy. And there is a particular dilemma when we look at industry, because high quality heat production for heavy industry is currently responsible for as much as 10% of global CO2 emissions. And that's particularly pertinent in relation to iron and steel and cement manufacture. For example, to produce iron and steel, you need very high temperatures, about 1200 degrees Celsius. Cement production requires an even slightly higher temperature, and they both need continuous operation. You can't have the power switching off and on continuously. You need reliable, continuous energy supply. Currently, that comes for the most part, from burning coal and natural gas. Now, there are some renewable alternatives, biofuels you can burn, renewable electricity produced from wind turbines and solar panels and so forth, burning hydrogen. These are all technically feasible alternatives. But unfortunately, they're very expensive compared to currently what we're spending on these processes. All these options would require at least twice as much expenditure, maybe as much as 20 times the current expenditure in order to achieve them if we were to transition to renewable options. The cheapest of these, according to one of the reports that's mentioned in one of the sources you can see at the bottom of the screen there, the cheapest of these is so-called blue hydrogen, which is basically burning natural gas. That's the fossil fuel we're currently getting from, well, we used to get it from Russia quite a bit. Currently is coming with an even larger ecological footprint from Qatar and places like that, burning that, but sticking a carbon capture and storage device machine on top of it to capture, well, they reckon about 70% of the CO2 probably that comes off it. Unfortunately, widespread commercial scale CCS has yet to emerge. Carbon capture and storage has been talked about for a long time, but it still hasn't taken off as a technology. And part of the reason for that is because the costs associated with it are significantly higher than just carrying on with the status quo. And in the absence of legislation requiring companies to install this kind of kit, it's not going to happen anytime soon. And also continuous operation, of course, required for iron, steel, and cement, has major renewable electricity supply and storage implications. Again, the question of what happens when the wind isn't blowing, when the sun isn't out, has to be addressed. We need to have some backup stores of reliable backup stores of energy in place when that happens. And of course, if you follow the zero carbon Britain scenario and you rely on biofuels for the bulk of that, then the more land you dedicate to biofuels, the less land you have available for growing food. And also there are, again, if you're using synthetic fertilizers on these things, which again in zero carbon Britain, that's what they assume is going to happen, there are some significant environmental implications in terms of soil degradation and in terms of runoff polluting watercourses that are in the environment as well. So there's a lot of complications in this once you start looking at the detail of what's involved. Okay, let's move on to look at specific metals that are used in renewable technologies. So this is organized according to different metals that go into battery technology, solar photovoltaic, and wind power. And they're all, in their own ways, critically dependent on the supply of some of these metals. Now, aluminium and copper are the are the basics, really. I mean, if we're looking at an electrified future, an electrified renewable future, aluminium and copper, because they're used for transmission apart from anything else, they make the wires that connect stuff together, are absolutely indispensable. As you can see, they appear across the piece there. Lithium is a key component for battery technologies that are currently ascendant battery technologies. And lithium comes from certain parts of the world, particularly parts of South America, the so-called lithium triangle, but also Australia. And rare earth elements, dysprosium and neodymium. Now, these are essential for electric vehicles, but also for permanent magnet wind turbines. And these are the big directly geared ones that are out to sea for the most part. They don't need very much of this stuff, but they are critical components of the magnets that actually make the things work. And as we'll see, where these rare earths can be sourced is restricted, and there are particular again, pollution issues associated with accessing them. But simply in terms of demand, this is the results of these are the results of a World Bank study that looked at the demand for copper, nickel, cobalt, and lithium under the Sustainable Development Scenario that they applied from the International Energy Agency. And the red line really is the one I want you to look particularly at the way in which lithium demand goes through the roof, and indeed cobalt demand. Cobalt, again, is a key ingredient of the currently prevailing battery technologies that are in electric vehicles, but also in domestic battery storage units. It just goes completely through the roof because energy storage in a renewable future is a critical component of the overall mix. And a guy called Sam Misho, who's an Australian guy working for the Finnish government, did some simple maths, and he basically said, what would happen? What would happen if overnight we were to change all the cars and all the vans across the world into electric vehicles? What implications would that have for mineral demand? And this is minerals going into the batteries in these vehicles. And as you can see, the cobalt demand in particular, overnight we would use up 95% of global reserves of cobalt, nickel 40 something percent, graphite almost 20%. By the way, this excludes heavy goods vehicles because the batteries required to power them would be so heavy it just wouldn't be viable. You know, the batteries would be heavier than the freight the vehicles are meant to be carrying. And similarly, agricultural equipment also. You couldn't put a battery on a tractor because it would just sink in the mud, essentially. You have to find some other fuel source for that. That's where the biofuels probably will come in. And so, not surprisingly, we're going to need lots more mines in order to access these various minerals. And here's a report from a couple of years ago suggesting that as many as 400 new mines will be needed to meet future electric vehicle battery demand. And that's in isolation from any additional battery demand required to keep the grid up and running when the wind isn't blowing and the sun's not shining. And this I thought was a particularly poignant article that came out last year about a place called Tregenec, a coastal area in Brittany, where locals, according to the report, are living above what they say feels like a time bomb because 130 meters below their homes lies the country's second largest deposit of lithium, which, as we've noticed, is a key component in the batteries used to power electric vehicles. And mining the so-called white gold, as lithium sometimes described, will involve digging up a protected nature reserve, in this case, located on a migratory route for birds, destroying something that took millions of years to create. Again, the tension here, that's what we've already lived with throughout the industrial era, between maintaining the natural environment and honoring it and allowing biodiversity to flourish, the tension between that and accessing the raw materials we want to secure the lifestyle we want is very, very real here. And while it's happening over there, I don't know, in South America or Australia or in Africa, you know, it's easy to kind of turn a blind eye to it. But when it's happening on your doorstep, well, that's a different kettle of fish, isn't it? There's a study that came out of Princeton University a couple of years ago, and basically they said, what would you require in terms of transmission and distribution cabling if we were to look to electrify the whole country by 2050. In other words, we were to move aggressively to a supply which was constrained to be 100% renewable. And again, as in zero carbon Britain, not rely on nuclear at all, but also assume that carbon capture and storage doesn't take off or isn't available to us too. And fossil fuels are being completely eliminated by 2050. How much additional wiring would we need across the country if that were to happen? And they reckon that they would need 5 times as much in terms of cabling, both overhead and in the ground, than they currently have. An increase of 5 times. And that's huge. And the International Energy Agency, in their sustainable development scenario for 2040, calculated that it would take an additional 84 million kilometers of new and replacement transmission and distribution cabling in order to bring about this sustainable development scenario. Now, that's a lot of cabling. And in fact, my mathematics are correct, it's enough to go to the moon and back 110 times. And within that, copper and aluminium, which are the essential building blocks of the wires that connect us together, demand for that, simply for the grid, for the electricity grid around the world, would double by 2040. So again, the demand on materials here is huge. What about recycling, you might say? Surely we can recycle some stuff and reduce the overall demand significantly through doing that. Well, here is an example of somebody who's done some figures on this. And just to illustrate how this works, look at the one on the right-hand side. Now, that's copper. Now, at the moment, at currently recycling rates, this is the brown, these are the two brown bars that you can see there. Something like, I would say, looking at that, 35 to 40% of the copper that goes into something new that's being built today is recycled. It's secondary. Now, they reckon that if you were to aspirationally scale up to 100% end-of-life recycling by 2050, so that everything, in other words, everything that's got copper in it gets recycled by 2050, you'd still find yourself in a situation where you were having to rely on about 40% of primary copper to make new stuff at that point. Only about 60% of it would be available to produce to go into producing new stuff by 2050, simply because of the volume of demand for copper compared to the stuff that's becoming available as it's recycled. And just to take one more example there, if you look at the lithium column, which is the purple one, the second pair of columns, at the moment, hardly any lithium is recycled at all, virtually zero. It's all primary lithium we're relying on. So even if we were to very aspirationally scale up our end-of-life recycling rates to 60% by 2050, we'd still be in a situation where about, indeed, 60% of the lithium going into new batteries that were being produced in 2050 would have to be primary lithium that was actually newly mined from the salt flats of Bolivia or wherever it might happen to be. So, recycling, great, has to be done. It's a positive option, but it has real challenges in terms of scaling up to the level of demand that we're required in moving to a wholly electrified post-fossil fuel global economy. I'm conscious that time is getting on, so I'm going to quickly whiz through this. Solar panels also have their challenges. Mining presents a huge problem because in terms of accessing all these metals that we've just discussed, again, because we've plucked the low-hanging fruit first, getting new stuff out means creating more and more waste per unit of useful output. And there are various ways in which that can be measured. I like this quote again from Simon Michaud. Large portions of the Andes mountain range constitute one massive copper deposit of extremely low grade. So one has this kind of nightmare scenario of leveling whole mountains in years to come in order to just acquire a tiny, tiny amount of ore that's useful, simply because all the low-hanging fruit, the easy to get at stuff has already been accessed. I'll just quickly, I'm just making a similar point in different language. Again, the rare earth materials, crucial for digital tech, essential for electric vehicles and direct drive wind turbines. For every ton of rare earth materials produced, 2,000 tons of toxic waste are produced. And the geopolitics of this are pretty scary. If you look at copper, nickel, cobalt, graphite, rare earth, lithium, and platinum, a lot of this stuff comes from Russia and China. Now, the reality is that, according to some definitions, this country is already at war with Russia, okay? And these days, Russia and China, they're getting on pretty well. So there's a question about where are we going to source these materials from in the future, even if the political will were there in this country to affect the kind of transition to renewable energy that I'm sure all of us want to see. And the transition itself is going to rely hugely on fossil fuels to power it. And this particular paper calculates that anything from 2 and 11 years of current energy-related CO2 emissions will be associated simply with a transition from our current fossil fuel paradigm to a renewable paradigm, because it'll take energy to mine the stuff, to make the machines that mine the stuff, to transport these materials around the world, and to build the turbines and the solar panels and all the infrastructure required for this newly electrified future. Also, there are huge, significant economic implications to that. Again, I've got time to go through that. Do you want to say a word about this, though? DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, is, if you want cobalt, which at the moment is a really crucial, sexy component of battery technology, the Congo is the place you want to go for it, because 58% of world cobalt production comes from there. DRC, if you know anything at all about it, is like a nightmare place to live. It's among those 10 most polluted areas in the world, the copper belt of the DRC. They reckon that there's a lot of artisanal mining that goes on there, which is very, very poorly regulated. As many as 40,000 child laborers working, as that picture illustrates, in deep hand-dug tunnels with inadequate safety care, the risk of cave-ins all over the place, high prevalence of rare birth defects. And this paper from Zagrafos and Robbins makes this point, that despite its intentions, the Green New Deal could lead to a new form of green colonialism that will continue to sacrifice the people of the global south to maintain our broken economic model. And I came across this just yesterday. DRC bleeds conflict materials for green growth. Inside every phone is the blood of a Congolese person, writes a student activist from Goma in DRC. And again, I'm afraid, the politics is all very complicated here. I'm afraid, there's all kinds of guerrilla activity going in there, which is being funded, I'm sorry to say, by people like us. And again, the fact that these really precious materials for the green transition are to be found in places like DRC, that's not a coincidence. These conflict minerals have been with us for a while. Well, that dilemma is only going to intensify over the years ahead. Coming to the end now, this is a paper by a couple of people called Megan Seibert and William Rees that came out a couple of years ago. Very controversial, generated a lot of hostile feedback from various people. But I want to share with you just a couple of quotes from it, because in a way it sums up a lot of the ground we've just covered. Renewable energy, they say in this paper, cannot deliver the same quantity and quality of energy as fossil fuels. The espoused technologies are not renewable because they require machines such as wind turbines and solar panels that require huge amounts of material input. Their production, from mining to installation, is fossil energy intensive, and producing them, particularly mining their metals and discarding their waste, entails egregious social injustices and significant ecological damage. Homo sapiens, they conclude, as a species, is an overshoot, ecological overshoot, exploiting ecosystems beyond their regenerative and assimilative capacities. The only viable response, they argue, is a managed contraction of the human enterprise until we arrive within the safely stable territory defined by ecological limits. More quotes there. We haven't got time for that. Just very quickly, I don't know if you've come across David Holmgren, who is a pioneer, Australian guy, pioneer of, lost the phrase now, permaculture. He's a permaculture pioneer. And on his website, if you go to that, if you click on the link there, which davidholmgren.com.au, you will find 4 different scenarios that he envisages for power down moving forward in energy descent scenarios. If we accept that we're going to have less energy in the future, this is what it's going to look like. First of all, distributed power down, which is the most benign option, a bit like the kind of current green growth scenarios, but without the growth. Earth steward, that's where the wheels come off more rapidly because of fossil fuel depletion or because of very rapid environmental change or a combination of the two. This envisages a kind of very much a ground up rebuilding by local communities in a, again, relatively benign manner using renewable resources. The brown tech scenario he talks about, which is the one I think which most closely resembles where we are now, effectively is all about centralized power continuing to try to keep a hold on our existing paradigm. Massive investment by corporations and governments to extract the dregs of lower grade non-renewable resources and biofuels. That's exactly what the oil revolution has been about. As one petroleum geologist put it, when shale began to come on stream, we're like rats, he said, who, having finished the cornflakes, have now started to eat the cornflakes packet. That's kind of the level we've got to. And again, the political implications of this are not pretty. Growing hostility between the haves and the have-nots, growing authoritarianism, potentially ongoing states of emergency, ultimately perhaps leading to what he calls the lifeboat scenario. If you ever saw Mad Max films back in the 80s, that's pretty much what that looks like. And these could flow into each other in the way that he indicates there. Let me finish by reminding you of that initial quote from Orwell about our civilization as it was in 1937 being founded on coal. So for me, reflecting on all this, the question I'm left with is, as fossil fuels decline and renewable energy sources struggle to provide straightforward substitution, what kind of new civilization should we aim to build? Because that, I suggest, is really what's at stake here. And finally, for me, the cue for understanding what all this is about in the end is from Genesis chapter 2. The Lord God took the human, put him in the Garden of Eden to cultivate it and to keep it. That, in the end, is the human purpose, according to Genesis 2. To cultivate God's earth, to keep it, to preserve it, to honor it, but also to nurture it such that the best of creation can be brought to fruition. And this quote from the theologian John Milbank, again, I think is really helpful. Remembering that the worst we can do to the planet is only likely temporarily to discommode it and perhaps to destroy ourselves along the way, we should realize that environmental problems are entirely our problems, problems of our own making, of our perception and our attempts to relate as human beings. How do we see ourselves? Do we see ourselves according to that metaphor that we find in Genesis chapter 2, as those who are charged to cultivate and keep God's creation? Or do we see ourselves in a different way, as those who are there to exploit it to our own ends while we can and at whatever cost? So is there life after fossil fuels? Yes, indeed there is. Why not? There should be. There will be life. But it will, I suggest, not be life as we know it. How it'll be different and to what extent it'll be different is in our hands. I've gone on far too long, so I will now stop my oh gosh, it's much, much later than I thought it was. But anyway, that's it. Thank you for listening, folks. Thank you for your attention and your patience there. I don't know what you want to do now, Barbara, in terms of...
Thank you, John. That was fascinating, depressing, interesting, confirmatory. And I think joy in enough is probably one of my responses to this. But we've got about 10 minutes to have a few questions. Colin left some questions before he left, but let's see if there's anybody here who would like to come in. Catherine, you had a question. Would you like to just come in with yours?
John, Added, thank you. So my question is, in summary, if it's possible to summarize all you've said, it's so important to recognize the gravity of the implications of the green transition. That said, would it not be more possible to make some of the necessary shift in terms of less exploitative mining techniques and demands than it is to mitigate the global warming from burning fossil fuels? And then
yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think sort of technological advances in terms of mining technology, I'm not an expert on that. I'm sure there's scope for it, and also, for example, there's scope for kind clamping down on illicit mining in places like DRC in ways that exploit human labor and all the rest of it. I just think that the volume of additional stuff we're going to need in the future, though, is going to mitigate against that, and it'll more than compensate for any savings that are made in terms of more efficient technologies and so forth. Again, I'm not arguing for not doing this. I'm not saying it can't be done technologically, because it can be done. I'm not saying it shouldn't be done. What I'm saying is this is, I mean, there was a quote from a French writer that I had to skim over because of time. But essentially what he says is that the transition we're looking at is akin to each of those previous transitions between different between different energy regimes, from foraging to farming. I mean, that was a complete paradigm shift. And equally, the transition from farming to industrialization was another paradigm shift. What he says is that the transition to a renewable powered future is going to be precisely the same kind of world-changing set of events. And it can only happen, it will only happen on the back of some really significant economic, social and political dislocation. It's very hard to imagine it happening otherwise.
Thank you, John. Zizi, you have your hand up. Please do unmute yourself and come in.
I've got a couple of questions about some of the detail of your thing, but I think my main question, well, two main questions. Can we have a copy of your slides afterwards?
Yes.
But also, it's quite hard to live a zero carbon Britain lifestyle while everybody else is living the current one. Sure. And so how do you see that starting? So that's my main question. On the two details, I thought the Zero Carbon Britain report used hempcrete rather than concrete.
Used what? Hempcrete? Oh, right.
Yeah, concrete made from hemp rather than, well, right, rather than calcium carbonate, is it? The other thing that I thought, one of your charts didn't have anything for government and commerce in it, just had home, industry, and so that seemed to be a missing sector. Yes. But basically, how do we start to live the zero carbon lifestyle when everybody else isn't, is quite difficult. You know, it's fairly easy to be vegan. It's fairly easy to ride a bicycle. You can retrofit your house. But beyond that, you're not living still at the zero carbon Britain level.
Yeah, absolutely. We're embedded, aren't we, in a society which is still effectively operating on a fossil fuel basis. I mean, I think, well, I mean, I'm sure all of us in our own ways, to the extent that we can, have been trying to be conscious of our, you know, our ecological footprints, our carbon footprints in different ways. Obviously, we have an election coming up, and again, bringing pressure to bear on our MPs. I'll be quite honest with you. When I gave this talk back in October, somebody asked me, if you were Rishi Sunak, okay, what would you do apart from look for a new job? What would you do in order to kind of take forward the agenda that's implied by what you just shared with us? I genuinely question whether the kind of economic and political regimes that we've become accustomed to over the last 100 years or so can be maintained over the years to come. I genuinely do. I mean, I know that sounds very negative and very, very depressing. But again, if I had more time to look at David Holmgren's 4 scenarios, what I would encourage us to do is to find people in our own localities who are on the same wavelength as us, and to begin from the ground up to try to put together the rudiments of that second paradigm, which was the Earth Steward paradigm, which assumes that things are going to get pretty bad and that centralized power structures may struggle to actually maintain any kind of sense of order, and that it would be down to local communities to work together as well as possible to maintain some kind of semblance of decent living together in the years ahead. I know that may sound apocalyptic, but I for all kinds of reasons, I suspect that may be the case. So again, it's doing what I'm sure most of us are already doing, which is to find like-minded people in our localities and to try to be as imaginative as we can and as persistent as we can in the face of the discouragements that can come our way in putting together the rudiments of a pattern of life that will be sustainable in the future, regardless of what happens on the global scale, over which I think we have only very little agency in reality, I regret to say.
Thank you, John. Colin, you'd like to come in?
Hi, John. Have you seen or read any of the sort of exciting information around white hydrogen that's been in the press recently? And
Right.
is there a danger? I mean, there's a possibility it might buy us some time in the transition, but it could also enable a continuity of business as usual.
Yeah,
Should
yeah.
we find it, we may not actually, change our ways.
Colin, could you tell us what white hydrogen is, just quickly in
So
one
basically, it's
syllable?
naturally occurring hydrogen. This is a fairly recent discovery.
Yes.
Some people are calling it gold hydrogen because it may bring about another gold rush. And apparently there's two ways in which this happens. One is there's pockets of hydrogen which have been there since the Earth was sort of created,
Yeah.
but and quite vast quantities, but they may be buried or under deep sea, ocean, difficult to get to. But there's also one which is formed through a particular arrangement of geology where you get water coming onto some iron minerals, which releases hydrogen, often with some methane as well.
Yeah.
So it would need to be separated. But there's been a few discoveries recently. One is in France, and another one I think was in Mali, where they discovered almost by
Yes.
chance that hydrogen was being
Yes.
released. And there's potential for some quite large reserves or
Yeah.
reservoir of this. But obviously, again, it's an extraction technology.
Absolutely.
But the fossil fuel industry may be able to divert their activities away from fossil fuels to hydrogen because that's their skill in finding it. The downside to it, again, geopolitically, it could be some challenges because there's going to be
Absolutely.
just certain areas where
Yeah,
this
so
is.
so coming soon to a kind of a natural beauty spot near you, digging up. I mean, I think the extractive thing is huge. I think that probably therefore the net energy of this source is going to be pretty poor, actually. I mean, I came across the Mali report a few months ago. Now that you mention it, yeah, absolutely. Um, Hydrogen is extraordinarily difficult, I understand, to manage because did you ever see pictures of the Hindenburg? The Hindenburg or that airship from about 1920 that basically was filled with hydrogen and it went bang. It's an exceedingly difficult material to deal with. It also has it's because it seeps through metal even, and it goes up into the upper atmosphere and it interacts with free radicals up there, which at the moment are doing quite a good job for us in that they're interacting with methane that we release, which is obviously a greenhouse gas, and neutralizing that methane. Now, what the hydrogen does is it in turn neutralizes those free radicals so that they can't do their job of basically mopping up some of the methane that we're currently emitting. So although it isn't technically greenhouse gas itself, hydrogen does have a global warming potential associated with it. I will put a PDF of my presentation on the website, and on the last page is a bunch of links. There is a single resource there which I would really encourage you to look at, which is called The Great Simplification with Nate Hagens. He does a really interesting interview with a guy called Martin, who is a hydrogen expert, worked with hydrogen all his life.
John, I'm going to just come in and interrupt it. We can go to that resource. We're almost at the end. I want to bring John Anderson in with one last question, which I think is
thank you for raising that, Colin.
Issues. I think on justice issues. Is it, John? Come on in on Africa and the interconnections with electrical.
Yes, can you hear me? I hope. Can you hear me?
John?
Yes.
Yes. Please, could you say something about the interconnectors for electric cable from Morocco, Africa, because they have a potential of helping us and also Africans?
Yeah, so basically this is, I imagine what you're talking about here, John, is putting a huge, covering the Sahara Desert in solar photovoltaic cells, and putting a massive great big cable up into Europe so we can be powered by African energy. Is that the kind of scenario we're looking at?
Yes, Morocco is beginning to do it now.
Yeah. So absolutely, so that's possible. Again, if you're happy with the geopolitics of that, and becoming again dependent on countries in what historically has not been an awfully politically stable part of the world for producing your energy, that's fine. And again, logically, if you were looking at this from a kind of a God's eye point of view, this is exactly what you would do. You would use what resources remain to you and during the fossil fuel era to put in the infrastructure, which is going to enable us in parts of the world that are going to struggle otherwise to be able to access energy from places like Morocco and the wider Sahara area that potentially have enormous energy generation potential in terms of solar. It's the practicalities of putting it in place over any kind of time scale that is really going to be impactful given the rates of anthropogenic climate change that we're seeing, which is the challenge, I think. So the politics of it, the timescales of it, as well as inevitably the materials demand stuff that I just touched on in terms of the stuff that's required. Again, to produce a solar panel, you need temperatures in excess of 1400 degrees Celsius. So that industrial quality heat dilemma that I touched on becomes very, very pertinent again. Because all those solar panels at the moment, they're being built in China, and for the most part, they're being built by burning coal. Yeah. I mean, that's, it's one of the part of the craziness of our current situation.
The prize is great because Africa could benefit as well. And at the moment, we take their resources and run with them.
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely. It's the justice issues coming in there currently.
Absolutely.
They're not.
It's a new scramble for Africa, and I'm afraid it's going to get uglier rather than otherwise.
John, I'm going to call it to a halt, but I'm going to say we'll keep the link open for a few more minutes if anybody wants to stay on and talk some more. But John, thank you so much for that brilliant presentation. Absolutely fascinating. And you've raised a huge amount of issues for us to carry on thinking about and praying about, especially on the justice issues connected in with them.